Professor Kelthane's tentacles rippled with what the Vrex considered scholarly enthusiasm, though most species found the gesture vaguely threatening. His lecture hall, a converted atmospheric dome that accommodated 200 beings from 17 different worlds, buzzed with the particular energy that preceded academic blood sport. Today we examine perhaps the most curious case in our xenobiological archives, Kelthane announced, his voice carrying through the universal translators with practiced authority. A species so thoroughly convinced of its own exceptionalism that it constructed an entire mythology around impossible physical feats. The crystalline Jek in the front row chimed in harmonious agreement. Behind them, a cluster of gaseous nephri shifted colors in what their species considered polite attention. Over 97% of viewers here are watching without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the journey. Every click helps us grow stronger, and you'll never miss the next epic story. The insectoid crics whispered among themselves in ultrasonic frequencies that made the air itself seem to vibrate with gossip. Kelthane activated the holographic display, and there it was, a rotating model of a small blue-green world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star. Earth, he said, allowing just enough disdain to color the word. Earthworld of humanity, a species that achieved spaceflight despite laboring under the most remarkable collection of biological disadvantages we have yet catalogued. A nephri near the back pulsed orange with curiosity. Disadvantages, Professor? Where to begin? Kelthane's tentacles danced across his datapad. No natural armor, no redundant organs, no photosynthetic capability. Requires constant intake of both oxygen and water. Cannot survive in temperatures outside an absurdly narrow range. Possesses only 2 eyes, both facing the same direction, creating massive blind spots. And yet, he paused for dramatic effect, a technique he'd learned from studying human rhetorical patterns. And yet their cultural archives are filled with stories of individuals who could allegedly lift weights exceeding their own body mass by factors of 10 or more. Warriors who could fight for days without rest. Individuals who could survive injuries that should have resulted in immediate death. The crics cluster buzzed with what sounded like mechanical laughter. One of their speakers, a drone designated for classroom interaction, vocalized for the group. Professor, surely even primitive species understand the difference between entertainment and reality. You would think so, Kelthane agreed, but humans appear to have convinced themselves that these mythological figures, Hercules, who allegedly possessed the strength of gods, Achilles, who was supposedly invulnerable save for a single point on his heel, Ku Chulin, who could allegedly enter a battle frenzy that made him nearly unstoppable, represented actual historical individuals. The lecture hall filled with the various sounds of alien amusement. The Jek's crystalline structures chimed in ascending scales. The nephori cycled through amused yellows and greens. Even the usually stoic Vorthak delegation produced something resembling chuckles from their speaking chambers. In the very back of the hall, in a section typically reserved for auditing students, a single figure sat motionless. She had been so still throughout the lecture that several species with motion-based vision had nearly forgotten she was there. The most fascinating aspect, Kelthane continued, warming to his theme, is how these delusions of grandeur persisted even as humanity developed scientific method. They understood biology well enough to achieve genetic sequencing, yet continued to propagate stories of human exceptionalism that violated every natural law they themselves had discovered. The nephori who had spoken earlier pulsed a deeper orange. Professor, what became of this species? You mentioned them in past tense. Ah, yes. Kelthane's tentacles formed what the Vrex considered a gesture of mild regret. Sadly, humanity proved unable to adapt to galactic contact. They possessed insufficient natural advantages to compete with established species, and their psychological need to maintain delusions of specialness made integration challenging. The last confirmed human population was relocated to a preservation world approximately 3 centuries ago. More sounds of polite academic sympathy filled the hall. The Cricks whispered among themselves about the tragedy of evolutionary dead ends. A young Zhek chimed something that roughly translated to philosophical acceptance of natural selection. The figure in the back row stood up. The movement was fluid, controlled, and somehow managed to draw the attention of every being in the hall without making a sound. She was definitely human. The basic bipedal structure was unmistakable, even if the proportions were subtly different from the holographic models Kelthane had been displaying. "Professor," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the hall despite speaking at conversational volume, "I have a question about your data sources." Kelthane blinked, all 6 eyes, in sequence. "I beg your pardon?" "Your information about human physiology," she continued, beginning to walk down the steps toward the front of the hall. "Several of your baseline measurements appear to be incorrect." The hall fell silent, except for the ambient hum of life support systems. The human moved with an easy, loose-limbed gait that somehow managed to look both casual and purposeful. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Kelthane said, though his tentacles had begun the subtle color shifts that indicated Vrek's discomfort. "Our data comes from the most comprehensive biological surveys conducted during first contact." The human had reached the front of the hall now. Up close, it was easier to see the differences between her and the holographic models. She was perhaps a bit taller, her musculature more defined, her movements carrying a fluidity that the academic projections had failed to capture. Respectfully, "Professor, those surveys were conducted on human civilians who had been living in zero-G environments for extended periods. Using them as baseline measurements would be like judging Vrek's physical capabilities based on your elderly scholars rather than your deep ocean hunters." Several tentacles on Kelthane's head had gone completely pale. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," the human said with a small smile. "I'm stating that your conclusions about human mythological exaggeration may be premature. When you mentioned Hercules lifting enormous weights, what specific weight ratios were you citing as impossible?" The Cricks cluster had gone completely silent, which was unsettling in itself. Even the Nephore had stopped their constant color shifting, hanging motionless in their atmospheric suits. Kelthane consulted his datapad with movements that had become distinctly less confident. "The mythological accounts suggest strength levels approximately 10 to 12 times baseline human capability." The human nodded thoughtfully. "And what did your surveys establish as baseline human capability?" "Approximately 40% of average Vrek's capability for similar body mass." "I see." The human glanced around the lecture hall, taking in the sea of alien faces watching her with growing uncertainty. "Professor, would it be possible to request access to your strength testing equipment?" "I believe there may have been some measurement errors in your baseline data." The hall remained absolutely silent for several long moments. Finally, Kelthane's tentacles performed a gesture that roughly translated to academic resignation. "Class dismissed," he said quietly. "We will continue this discussion in our next session." As the various aliens began filing out of the hall, chattering among themselves in languages that ranged from crystalline chimes to ultrasonic whispers to chromatic color shifts, the human remained standing at the front of the lecture hall. She hadn't said another word, but her expression suggested that Professor Kelthane's education was about to begin. 3 days later, the Academy's combat simulation laboratory hummed with nervous energy. Word had spread through the student networks faster than light-speed communication. Something was happening in advanced xenobiology, and everyone wanted to witness it. The lab itself was a marvel of engineering, capable of generating environments from Arctic wasteland to methane swamps, complete with adjustable gravity, atmospheric composition, and hostile fauna. It had been designed to test the practical applications of different species' evolutionary advantages under controlled conditions. "Today we conduct field assessments," Professor Kelthane announced to his reassembled class, though his usual confidence had acquired a distinctly brittle quality. "Each species will demonstrate their natural capabilities in scenarios designed to highlight their evolutionary strengths." The JEC delegation went first, their crystalline bodies interfacing directly with the simulation's data streams. They navigated a complex maze of informational puzzles, their perfect memory matrices allowing them to process and retain patterns that would overwhelm most organic minds. Their performance was flawless, precisely as expected. The Nepheri followed, shifting to gaseous form and flowing through environmental barriers that would have stopped any solid being. They reformed at will, adapting their molecular density to match atmospheric pressure changes that spanned 3 different planetary classifications. The Crick's hive mind demonstration was particularly impressive. Their collective consciousness allowed them to coordinate across multiple simultaneous scenarios, sharing sensory data and tactical information instantaneously across their entire cluster. Each performance was met with polite academic appreciation. These were known quantities, after all, textbook examples of evolutionary specialization at its finest. "Remarkable adaptations," Kelthane commented after each demonstration, making notes on his pad. "Clear examples of how natural selection produces optimal solutions for survival challenges." The human had been observing from the sidelines, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She hadn't volunteered for any of the early demonstrations, and Kelthane had seemed content to let her wait. "And now," the professor announced, his tentacles rippling with what might have been anticipation or dread, "we come to our human participant." The simulation chamber cleared and began reconfiguring. Environmental parameters scrolled across the display screens: Earth standard gravity, Mediterranean climate, rocky terrain with limited cover. "I've selected a scenario from human historical archives," Kelthane continued. "The Battle of Thermopylae, though naturally we've corrected the physics to realistic parameters." A murmur ran through the assembled students. Everyone knew the story. It was taught in galactic history as an example of primitive species' tendency toward mythological exaggeration. 300 Spartan warriors allegedly holding off hundreds of thousands of Persian soldiers at a narrow mountain pass. Clearly impossible, but entertaining as a cultural artifact. "The scenario parameters," Kelthane read from his display, "recreate the strategic situation with accurate force ratios, realistic weapon effectiveness, and proper physiological limitations. The simulation will demonstrate why such an engagement would have been tactically untenable." The human stepped into the simulation chamber. She had changed into what appeared to be period-appropriate armor: bronze breastplate, round shield, and a spear that looked more like an oversized tool than a weapon. "Professor," called out the Nepheri from the previous session, "what exactly constitutes success in this scenario?" "Excellent question. The human participant needs to hold the designated IA position for a minimum of 1 standard hour while facing numerically superior opponents. Given the corrected physical parameters, we estimate the scenario will conclude in approximately 12 minutes. The Cricks cluster buzzed among themselves. What happens if the human participant achieves the hour requirement? Kelthane's tentacles performed what might charitably be called a shrug. Then our models require recalibration. However, based on established human physical limitations, This outcome has a probability of— Professor, the human interrupted from inside the simulation chamber. Are you ready to begin? Her voice carried oddly in the chamber's atmosphere, and something about her posture had changed. She stood differently now, looser, more fluid, as if the armor had transformed her from an academic observer into something else entirely. Kelthane activated the simulation. The first wave of Persian soldiers materialized at the far end of the narrow pass. The chamber's displays showed their approach. 200 warriors armed with spears, swords, and bows, advancing in formation toward the single defender. What happened next made several alien students question whether the simulation equipment was functioning properly. The human moved, not the careful, controlled movements she'd demonstrated in the lecture hall, but something that seemed to flow between physics and poetry. Her spear became an extension of her body, striking with precision that the targeting computers struggled to track. Her shield deflected attacks from angles that should have been geometrically impossible. But it wasn't just her technique that defied expectations, it was her endurance. 20 minutes into the simulation, she should have been exhausted. Instead, she seemed to be warming up. Professor, one of the JEC chimed nervously, your displays are showing some unusual readings. Kelthane was staring at his instruments with an expression his species typically reserved for encountering paradoxes. The biometric sensors must be malfunctioning. They're indicating that the human's physical output is increasing rather than decreasing. 40 minutes into the simulation, the human had not only held her position, but had actually advanced several meters down the pass. The simulation's strategic AI was adapting, sending larger waves of more diverse opponents, but the result remained unchanged. This is impossible, muttered a young Vorthak. No single organism can maintain this level of physical output without depleting stored energy reserves. The human, apparently hearing this through the chamber's communication system, grinned. It was not a reassuring expression. You might want to check your baseline assumptions about human energy metabolism, she called out, never breaking her defensive pattern. Also, your models seem to assume we operate at consistent output levels. What do you mean? Kelthane asked, though his voice had become distinctly smaller. The human's response came between spear thrusts that dispatched 3 opponents in a single flowing motion. Sometimes we get angry. The simulation reached the 1-hour mark. The human was still standing, still fighting, and according to the biometric readings, still accelerating. Kelthane shut down the simulation. The chamber went quiet, except for the sound of environmental systems cycling back to neutral. The human stood in the center of the space, barely breathing hard, still holding her spear in a ready position. Well, she said into the silence, that was educational. Around the observation deck, 200 alien students sat in various states of what their species considered stunned contemplation. The Crix cluster had gone completely silent, a phenomenon that typically occurred only when they encountered something that fundamentally challenged their collective understanding of reality. Professor Kelthane's tentacles had gone completely pale. I believe, the human continued, stepping out of the simulation chamber and beginning to remove her armor. We need to discuss your research methodology. The emergency faculty meeting convened at 0300 Standard Time, which meant it was serious enough to wake beings who didn't technically sleep. Dean Vextaler's office accommodated representatives from 12 different atmospheric requirements, creating a fog of exotic gases that would have been toxic to most life forms. The simulation logs don't lie, announced Dr. Kurth, head of biometric sciences, her Vorthak breathing apparatus clicking with agitation. Either our equipment experienced simultaneous cascading failures across 17 different monitoring systems, or we've been fundamentally wrong about human physiology for 3 centuries, finished Professor Kelthane, whose tentacles had remained a sickly pale color since the demonstration. Dean Vex Taylor's photosynthetic patches darkened to deep purple, never a good sign. Explain to me how an entire academic discipline can be built on faulty data. The original contact surveys, Kelthane began, were conducted on humans who had been living in artificial environments for generations, interrupted a new voice from the doorway. The human stepped into the meeting room, and several faculty members instinctively shifted away. She moved with that same fluid precision they'd witnessed in the simulation, but now it seemed less like academic curiosity and more like barely contained potential energy. You weren't invited to this meeting, Dean Vex Taylor stated, though without much conviction. Your student network communications aren't exactly encrypted, the human replied, settling into a chair that had been designed for a completely different body structure, but somehow accommodated her perfectly. Besides, I thought you might want to discuss your curriculum revision plans. Dr. Kurth's breathing apparatus made a sound like grinding metal. What curriculum revision? The human smiled, and several faculty members discovered new depths of unease. The one you're going to need after your students start asking uncomfortable questions, which should begin in approximately. She glanced at a timepiece that looked nothing like any technology the Academy had on file. 4 minutes. As if summoned by prophecy, the office's communication system activated. Images appeared of student gatherings throughout the Academy, Crix clusters vibrating with agitated discussion, Zhek formations producing discord harmonics that made the audio system's feedback, Nepheri swirling in patterns that typically indicated deep philosophical crisis. What are they discussing? Dean Vex Taylor demanded. Mythology, the human answered. Specifically, they're wondering what other impossible stories might turn out to be user manuals. The communication system chimed with an incoming priority message. Professor Velthanis of Comparative Literature appeared on screen, her usual academic composure replaced by something approaching panic. Dean, we have a situation in the archives. The students have been requesting access to human mythological databases. They're not reading them as cultural artifacts anymore. They're analyzing them as technical documentation. Another chime. Dr. Zarian from Applied Physics. Dean, I need to speak with you about some rather disturbing calculations my students have been running regarding human structural engineering stories. Something about a tower reaching into space? Then came xenoarchaeology. The students are asking if we've ever physically verified the destruction of human settlements. Apparently, they've been researching something called Phoenix Legends. The human watched this cascade of academic crisis with evident satisfaction. It's fascinating how quickly institutional certainty can crumble when you introduce a single variable that doesn't fit the model. What do you want? Dean Vex Taylor asked, her photosynthetic patches now cycling through colors that had no names in most languages. Nothing dramatic, just a small adjustment to your xenobiology curriculum. Maybe start treating human capabilities as unknowns rather than established limitations. Dr. Kurth's apparatus produced what might have been laughter if the Vorthak were capable of finding anything amusing about existential academic crises. Do you have any idea what that would mean? We'd have to recalibrate our understanding of biological possibility across hundreds of species. Exactly, the human said cheerfully. Professor Kelthane, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. The preservation world, the last human populations, if our data has been wrong. They're not preserved, the human finished. They're training. The room fell silent, except for the various atmospheric processors maintaining life support for a dozen different biologies. Finally, Dean Vex Taylor spoke. Training for what? The human stood, her movement somehow managing to be both casual and vaguely threatening. For the conversation that's about to happen between the galactic community and a species you thought went extinct because you couldn't imagine them adapting to your standards. She moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Professor Kelthane? You might want to update your lecture notes. That mythology you've been teaching is primitive fantasy. Some of us have been using it as a training curriculum. After she left, the faculty sat in various states of what their species considered stunned realization. The communication system continued chiming with reports from across the academy. Students questioning fundamental assumptions, requesting access to previously dismissed databases, and most disturbing of all, beginning to wonder what capabilities their own species might possess that had been overlooked by academic orthodoxy. Professor Kelthane stared at his datapad, where 3 centuries of carefully researched human limitations stared back at him. With movements that suggested profound resignation, he began deleting files. How long? Dean Vextalar asked quietly. Before this spreads beyond the academy? Dr. Kurth consulted her instruments with the air of someone checking the structural integrity of a building during an earthquake. The student networks have connections to 17 different worlds. Communication delay suggests the questions are already spreading through academic institutions across the sector. And how long before those questions reach governmental attention? They already have, announced a new voice from the communication system. The screen activated to show Ambassador Keth Nalar, the Vrex diplomatic representative to the Galactic Cooperative Council. Behind him, barely visible in the background, were figures that represented more political authority than typically gathered in one location outside of major crises. We've been monitoring Academy communications, the ambassador continued, and we have questions of our own. Specifically, we'd like to know why our intelligence networks have been unable to locate any trace of human settlements for the past 50 years. Professor Kelthane's tentacles went completely white. We'd also like to understand, Ambassador Keth Naylor continued, why our deep space monitoring stations have been detecting what appear to be human-manufactured vessels in regions of space we classified as uninhabitable. Dean Vex Taylor's photosynthetic patches had stopped cycling through colors entirely, settling on a shade that indicated complete system shutdown. But most importantly, the ambassador concluded, we'd like to arrange a meeting with your human consultant. It seems we have some rather significant diplomatic protocols to discuss. The communication screen went dark, leaving the faculty alone with the growing realization that their academic crisis had just become something considerably larger. Outside the dean's office, 200 alien students continued their impromptu research sessions, discovering that the universe was a significantly more interesting and dangerous place than their textbooks had suggested. 6 months after what the Academy's official records euphemistically termed the methodological adjustment period, Professor Kelthane found himself in the peculiar position of being educated by his own curriculum. His office had been relocated to a smaller space, not as punishment, but because the xenobiology department had expanded by 300% and needed the room. Where once a single course had examined evolutionary limitations, there now existed entire degree programs dedicated to unexplored biological potential and comparative mythology as technical documentation. The human, who had eventually introduced herself as Dr. Marina Voss, though she insisted on being called by her first name, occupied what had formerly been the dean's conference room. Her new title, Visiting Scholar of Applied Biological Dynamics, had been created specifically for her, mostly because the existing academic hierarchy couldn't quite accommodate someone who had single-handedly revolutionized an entire field by proving that 3 centuries of research had been asking the wrong questions. "Marina," Kelthane said, entering her office with the careful deference he'd learned to adopt. "The Crix delegation has submitted another request." She looked up from a holographic display showing what appeared to be architectural blueprints crossed with biological schematics. Her work had taken on an interdisciplinary character that made most faculty members dizzy. "Let me guess," she said, without pausing in her manipulation of the complex diagrams. "They want to understand how human berserker legends relate to combat effectiveness under stress conditions. Actually, they're asking about something called adrenaline mothers lifting vehicles off children. They've calculated that the described force requirements exceed baseline human musculature by factors that should result in immediate skeletal failure." Marina smiled, and Kelthane had learned to recognize that particular expression as a warning sign. Did they factor in emergency hormone cascades? What now? Kelthane, sit down. This is going to take a while. As she began explaining biochemical stress responses that somehow managed to temporarily restructure muscular and skeletal limitations, Kelthane found himself taking notes with the same frantic intensity he'd once observed in his struggling undergraduate students. The irony was not lost on him. The academy itself had transformed in ways that went far beyond curriculum adjustments. The student body had quadrupled as beings from across the galactic community arrived to study the human paradigm, a term that referred to the growing realization that most species had been dramatically underestimating their own capabilities by accepting academic limitations as biological absolutes. More significantly, the questions had spread. Vorthak researchers were investigating their own mythological accounts of individuals who could survive in vacuum. Nephori scholars were examining stories of ancestors who could allegedly maintain coherent consciousness across multiple planetary systems simultaneously. Even the pragmatic Zhek had begun wondering if their impossible historical accounts of individuals whose memory matrices could interface directly with quantum probability fields might deserve scientific investigation rather than cultural dismissal. "Marina," Kelthane said during a pause in her explanation of adrenal stress biochemistry, "I need to ask you something that's been troubling me." "Go ahead." "The preservation world. The official records show that humanity requested isolation to preserve their cultural development without interference. But that wasn't really what happened, was it?" Marina's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy. "What do you think happened, Kelthane?" "I think," he said carefully, "that when the galactic community decided humanity couldn't adapt to our standards, someone suggested that instead of trying to adapt to your standards, we should develop our own." "Very good. And what else do you think?" Kelthane's tentacles performed a gesture that indicated deep unease. "I think the preservation world was actually a training ground, and I think the time period for that training has concluded." "Excellent analysis. What led you to that conclusion?" "The reports from our deep space monitoring stations. The vessels they've been detecting aren't just human-manufactured. They're built using engineering principles that seem to ignore several fundamental limitations we consider absolute, and they're not coming from the preservation world." "Where do you think they're coming from?" Kelthane consulted his datapad, though he'd memorized the relevant information weeks ago. "Everywhere. The detection patterns suggest human settlements in systems we classified as uninhabitable, on worlds we determined couldn't support complex life, in regions of space we considered strategically irrelevant." "And what does that suggest about human adaptation strategies?" "That instead of adapting to environments you found suitable, humans adapted to environments you found impossible." Marina nodded approvingly. "Now you're thinking like a xenobiologist instead of an academic bureaucrat." A soft chime indicated an incoming priority communication. Marina gestured, and Ambassador Keth Naylor's image appeared in the office. "Dr. Voss, we've received a response from the diplomatic entities that have been responding to our communication attempts." "Diplomatic entities?" the individuals claiming to represent human interests in interspecies negotiations. They've agreed to a formal meeting. Marina's expression became carefully neutral. When and where? They've suggested the Academy. Specifically, your former lecture hall. They indicated that the location has symbolic significance. After the ambassador's image disappeared, Kelthane sat in thoughtful silence. Finally, he spoke. Marina, I have one more question. What's that? This morning I received a research inquiry from a student who wanted to investigate human legends about something called Florida Man. She claimed these stories represent a documented phenomenon of humans performing actions that violate multiple laws of physics, biology, and common sense, apparently just to see what would happen. Marina's smile returned, broader and more unsettling than before. Kelthane, she said, I think your education is just getting started. Outside the office windows, the Academy bustled with activity as representatives from dozens of species continued their crash course in reconsidering everything they thought they knew about biological possibility. In the lecture halls where the story had begun, alien students were discovering that the universe was significantly more dangerous, more wonderful, and more full of potential than their textbooks had ever suggested. And somewhere in the depths of space, vessels built by a species that refused to accept limitations were making their way toward a reunion that was 3 centuries overdue. The gates, it turned out, had been temporary anyway.